This week, President Trump announced that he's going to be offering a voluntary severance to 2 million federal employees. So what exactly does this mean and what are the implications of it? Well, let's talk through it in this video. Hey everybody, it's Brian from A Life After Layoff, and in case you don't know who I am, I'm a corporate recruiter and an HR professional with over 20 years of experience interviewing and hiring thousands of people into some of the world's largest and most well-respected companies. And on this channel, I make it my mission to demystify how hiring and careers work behind the scenes. So if you're interested in more of this type of content, make sure you hit that subscribe button. So a memo just came out indicating that the Trump administration is going to be offering a rather generous severance package to federal employees who opt to take it. And this could impact potentially 2 million people. Now, of course, not all 2 million people are going to take the severance, but the government does expect between 5 and 10% of the government employees to accept the terms of the severance. And that's expected to save up to $100 billion annually in government expenses. Now, this offer does extend to all full-time federal employees, but there are some notable exemptions here, namely military personnel, people who are in the post office, and those who are involved with immigration and national security. Now, what's interesting is the timing here because it does correspond with the mandate for people who work remotely in the federal government to return back into the office. And in fact, it seems to incentivize people who don't wish to return back into the office to accept the offer because it's going to pay people all the way through the first week of September. Now, there are some stipulations. They have to accept it by February 6th, so they've only got about a week here. In fact, these types of severances are set up so that when a person takes them voluntarily, it's going to be a lot more beneficial than if they were to wait for the other shoe to drop later on down the line. So there's a relatively quick decision-making process for a lot of federal employees who have some serious thinking to do. And one of the hallmark criteria of this memo of people who don't opt to take the voluntary severance is that they have to respond to the email saying that they either want to resign or they don't want to resign. And I guess that filters them into one bucket or another. But if you decide to stay on, there is an expectation that you'll be more productive in your current job. And that's a really interesting parallel to the Department of Government Efficiency. And this whole program to me seems like it's President Trump making good on his promise to look at government spending very closely, and he created this department that's going to obviously be led by Elon Musk. The memo that went out does seem to be very Elon Musk-esque in that it sounds very similar to what he sent out to the Twitter employees. And if you recall, a few years ago when he acquired Twitter and decided to eliminate, I think it was like 75% of their workforce, it was worded very similarly. You had to respond back to an email stating that you wanted to keep your job at Twitter, or if you didn't, they would consider it to be you tendering your resignation. So there's a kind of a link there. And secondly, the people who did stay on at Twitter were expected to work very vigorously. And that's a hallmark of Elon Musk as well. So when I read through the memo, it seems a lot like how Elon Musk manages his businesses. He's forcing people back into the office. He's requiring deep and intensive work for people who do stick around. And if you don't want to stick around, you have to respond back to an email either one way or another. Now, another interesting aspect of this is if you accept the terms of the voluntary severance, you're likely to be placed on administrative leave until the time of your separation. And there might be a peculiar reason why, and we'll talk about that in just a second here. But first, let's talk about what happens if you don't accept the terms of the voluntary severance. Can they lay you off at a later date? And that's probably what most people would be expecting as the Department of Government Efficiency is looking more closely at government spending. Trump is making more strategic decisions in that regard. So I think it's a very valid concern. So let's look at how layoffs typically work in the public versus private sector. In the private sector in the United States, there is a concept called at-will employment, which impacts nearly all of the states. I think there's only a couple of states that don't have at-will employment. And if you're not familiar with what at-will employment means, essentially it means that an employer can hire, fire, change the conditions of your work, move you around, change job title, do whatever they want in the context of employment, so long as it's not breaking a law or illegal. And on the other side of the coin, the employee has the same ability to quit a job without any reason, any notice at all. Now, obviously, at-will employment favors the employer much more than it does the employee. But as a federal employee, are you subjected to at-will employment? In most cases, at-will employment does not apply to federal employees. So in general, terminating a federal employee is much more difficult than it would be for a private employer. They have to go through due process. There has to be a particular reason why they're terminating. It's like kind of the usual stuff. They stole something, insubordination, all that normal stuff that you would get fired from if you were working in a private entity. But in general, it's a lot more difficult to terminate underperforming employees or poor performers. There's also labor unions that impact a lot of these government entities, and so they have to operate under bargaining unit agreements, etc. But there's also a plan to reclassify a lot of these federal employees into different classifications that would make it potentially easier to remove them from their positions forcibly. Now, this isn't a new movement, and there's been some attempts over the years to try to reclassify employees, but this is the latest attempt, and it comes at a time when they're offering these voluntary severances. But going back to the administrative leave, there is some speculation that by moving them into the administrative leave status, that they could bypass certain protections and allow them to move more quickly on terminating low-performing employees. So I'll answer the question that's not even being asked, is this a good time to be a federal employee? Well, obviously there's a lot of uncertainty in the market, and there's a lot of things that are happening behind the scenes. Certain positions are being eliminated, certain departments are being eliminated and looked at very aggressively. I have to really think long and hard before I jump headfirst into a federal job until I see how the dust settles. So what do you think? Are these severances a good or a bad thing? On one hand, they're very generous. Offering severance all the way through potentially September is among the best severances you'll probably expect to ever get. But on the other hand, what happens if you don't accept it? It sounds like it's a kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't. Anyway, I'm going to stay close to this one. I appreciate you watching. We'll see you on the next one.